Welcome, gun runner.
I was so pleased to see the Atari Falcon win the latest Amazing Facts poll on my channel, and by some margin I may add, with the Sinclair QL in a very distant second place. The follow-up to the best-selling ST and Atari's very last home computer, it was the only major Atari system that I hadn't covered in this series, having already looked at the 2600, 5200, 7800, 400, 800, ZEGS, ST, Lynx, Jaguar and Jaguar CD. And now we have finally fixed that omission, and judging by that 46% vote share, you're all just as excited to get this one started as I am. I'm not going to go into too much about the Falcon in this intro, as the rest of the video will explain everything you need to know, but I will mention that the computer debuted in Germany first in October 1992, with the French and UK launches taking place in subsequent months, meaning it arrived on the market at almost exactly the same time as the Amiga 1200, its biggest rival. But by this time, IBM PC compatibles were starting to take control of the home computer market, so you could say its fate was already sealed. But that doesn't mean there isn't an interesting story to tell here, as we'll soon find out. Let's start off with a simple but quite fun fact, and that is the name of the computer itself, because during the development phase the Falcon wasn't actually known as that at all. Instead it had another bird-themed name, Sparrow. The reason it didn't keep this name is actually quite simple. It was decided that Sparrow didn't sound very powerful, so they switched to the name of a bird of prey instead, and Falcon seemed to fit well. But you might be wondering how it came to have a bird name at all, especially as Atari had used names of big cats for their console range, with Lynx, Panther and Jaguar all being used. Although I should note at this point that the big cat naming convention was actually a complete accident. The Lynx's ability to link up to 16 machines together for some multiplayer mayhem was actually responsible for its name, and this is also the reason for the system's logo with its linked together X at the end. The unreleased Panther was in fact named after a car belonging to one of its designers, the Panther Callista, leading to Sam Tramiel naming its replacement after a car of his own, the iconic Jaguar XJS. So you should now know that the Atari STE was actually known as the Robin during its design phase, which is why they went with Sparrow for the Falcon. You do have to wonder if the bird-based moniker would have stuck for Atari's home computers had the Falcon been a success. There were a number of silly decisions from Atari themselves that cost both the Falcon and the company dearly, most of which are detailed in this video. But for me, this one is the most idiotic decision of all, and to explain it properly we have to rewind to 1992 as the new computer neared completion. It had already been decided that the Falcon would be launched in Europe first, which made perfect sense, as the ST had been very successful in this territory, far more so than Atari's homeland in fact. However, it hadn't been decided who would take control of this launch, Atari UK or Atari Germany, the two leading markets and offices in this region. Atari UK, led by Managing Director Bob Glido and Marketing Manager Darryl Still, put a case across that the Falcon should be marketed the same way as the ST was, as a great all-round computer that was equally adept at playing games as it was at performing more serious applications. However, in Germany the ST had been mainly marketed as a business computer, with games very much taking a back seat, and their office wanted to market the Falcon in the same way. Eventually Atari Germany won out, but nobody is really sure why. Indeed, Darryl himself told me that they believed the UK would get the nod, given that was the ST's most successful market. The computer was launched in Germany first, with a far more muted UK launch happening just after, and a distinct lack of fanfare to go with it. Atari's decision pretty much alienated all the big UK software publishers who were interested in making games for it, and the only titles to arrive in the first few months were from Atari themselves. Granted, this lineup was actually quite solid, with arcade conversions such as Road Riot and Steel Talons alongside popular puzzle game Dino Dudes and Jeff Minter's superb Llamas app, but it just wasn't enough, especially when you consider the glut of games the rival Amiga 1200 was receiving. You have to wonder if things would have been different had Atari UK got their way, got major software publishers involved and got the press on their side. It's another fascinating what-if story to add to the long list from the Atari timeline. One of the biggest criticisms of the Falcon from the moment it was unveiled was that it reused the case in the Atari ST. Most specifically the enhanced models, just in a slightly different shade. It was pretty clear that Atari were just trying to save money, though they claimed it was so they could get it to market quicker, promising that completely redesigned, more PC-like models would soon follow. Within a few months of the Falcon's release, Atari revealed the new Falcon 030 Microbox, a completely redesigned unit in a tower-like case. Not long after this reveal, Atari upped the specs of this model slightly, telling us that the Microbox would now feature a more advanced Motorola 68040 CPU instead of the 030, and it would also feature an optional CD-ROM drive instead of a disk drive. It was also announced that the Microbox could lie flat like the Mega ST and TT, or upright with the use of a stand, more like a PC tower, or the Sharp X68000. Now, as many of you know, this redesign is probably the greatest piece of Atari Falcon lore, as the design of the Microbox was later sold to Sony, who used it for their PlayStation 2 console. But what is never mentioned is that Atari actually borrowed the design from somewhere else themselves, which will probably surprise you greatly, because back in 1985, leading UK computer manufacturer Sinclair Research unveiled several new models of their business-oriented QL. One of these designs was christened the Janus, and as you can see it looks remarkably similar to the Falcon Microbox. Designed by Rick Dickinson, the QL Plus, as it was also known, would utilise their revolutionary new wafer drive. But sadly it never came to market, as Sinclair were taken over by big rivals Amstrad the following year, and the first thing they did was completely cancel the QL. Now you're probably all wondering what the connection here is, and this is where it gets even more interesting, because anyone familiar with the Falcon's console cousin, the Jaguar, will know that the 64-bit beast wasn't actually designed by Atari. It was the creation of a British company called Flair Technology, and Flair was in fact made up of ex-Sinclair staff, including John Matheson, Ben Cheese and Richard Miller, who was in fact the president of Atari at this time. So Richard didn't just call up his old mates to help Atari deliver a new games console, it seemed he also revived some memories of his time at Sinclair to improve their home computer offering too. Richard would of course join Sony Computer Entertainment in a similar role after leaving Atari, and the design followed him there too. I do wonder if Rick Dickinson knew Atari had borrowed his design, and indeed made a lot of money out of it when they sold it to Sony. Sadly, it's impossible to ask him, as the legendary designer, who also came up with the iconic looks of the Sinclair ZX Spectrum and ZX81, as he sadly passed away on the 24th of April 2018, while in Texas receiving further treatment for cancer first diagnosed in 2015. As anyone who owned an ST will know, the main reason the computer was so simple and easy to use, which definitely contributed to its huge success, was its TOS operating system, which, when combined with the GEM desktop GUI, gave users an early Windows-like experience. There still seems to be arguments over what TOS stood for, with many claiming it was an acronym of Trammel Operating System, but the official line from Atari was always that it was a shortening of the operating system. Yes, it really is that simple. The Falcon of course came with its own new version, TOS4, which helped with the backwards compatibility and familiarity of course. This added support for the DSP, 16MHz Blitter chip and video overlay, pop-up menus, 3D windows and dialog objects, 256 colour animated icons, soft-loaded fonts, drag-and-drop applications, background window manipulation, extensible file systems and a new CPX module for international localization configurations. But rather strangely it was only single tasking, which baffled people at the time when one of the key selling points of the Amiga over the ST was its multitasking operating system. This was later fixed with the creation of Multitos, which Atari would bundle with all new machines, but this came on disk rather than being in ROM like the standard versions of TOS. TOS4 would also be updated several times, with 4.04 being the last official version. although TOS 4.08 was used on the Milan Computers Falcon clones, and Atari developed both TOS 4.92 and TOS 4.98 for later models, but neither was ever used. However, both have been found and recovered in more recent years that can be burned to a ROM chip for use in a real Falcon. A lot is made of the fact that the Falcon used a 32-bit Motorola 68030 CPU, hence the 030 part on the end of its name. But this isn't actually the most interesting thing about the chipset in the computer, and it wasn't even a new thing, with the same CPU being found in the earlier Atari TT productivity computer. The biggest selling point of the Falcon was in fact its powerful graphics and sound chips. First of all, we have a Motorola 56001 DSP clocked at 32 MHz that can perform up to 16 million instructions per second. Though it's oriented to sound processing and is directly connected to the RAM to help with this, it's also capable of graphics processing too, especially things like fractals, deformations, 3D projections and JPEG compression. It can even play MP3 files in real time when combined with the power of the main CPU. Another huge innovation was the VDEL video controller, which was only limited by its speed and RAM, both of which can be accelerated and upgraded of course. It can display up to 65,536 colours simultaneously, giving it 16-bit true colour capabilities, and can also interlace images as well as generate higher resolutions than the 640x480 standard. It can also replicate all three of the ST's standard graphics modes too, of course, for backwards compatibility. The only real bottleneck is that it shares system memory with the CPU, which is one reason why most people immediately upgraded the standard 4MB of RAM in the Falcon to the full 14MB limit. The only real problem with the Falcon's design was the fact it only had a 16-bit data bus, which was a huge bottleneck. Many people criticised Atari for this decision, especially as the Atari TT had a full 32-bit bus. There really didn't seem to be any reason for this bizarre design choice other than to save money, something that Trammels were often guilty of sadly. Like the ST before it, the Amiga was also the great rival to the Falcon, but this time round it was a very easy win for the Commodore computer due to the failure of Atari's 32-bit machine in the marketplace, which I've already covered in great detail of course. But despite the clear difference in fate, people still love to compare the Amiga 1200 and Atari Falcon, and it would be remiss of me not to do so in this video. The first thing to point out is that unlike the 16-bit models before them, the more advanced 32-bit home micros don't actually have the same CPU as each other, with the Falcon having a much more powerful Motorola 68030, whilst the A1200 only has an 020. The Atari CPU is also quite a bit faster and has access to double the amount of standard RAM too. Although the latter is expandable in both models of course, the Falcon could be pushed up to 14MB internally, and the A1200 can only add an extra 8MB through the trapdoor. This first section might seem like a slam dunk for the Falcon, but the stupid decision to use the 16-bit data bus, as I mentioned in the last segment, was a big bottleneck compared to the Amiga's full 32-bit bus. I talked quite a bit about the graphics and sound chips in the Falcon in the last section of the video too, but we'll do a quick comparison with the Amiga 1200 here, and you'll see from the graphic on the screen that the Commodore computer did have a larger colour palette, but could display the same amount on screen without tricks, meaning there wasn't that big an advantage here. The Falcon also offered a higher resolution flicker-free monochrome mode, as the ST did before it, which was widely used for productivity packages. In terms of audio, the Falcon has a huge advantage with its advanced DSP chip. The decision to reuse the Paula chip for the 16-bit Amigas in the new models with no improvements was a very bad decision indeed by Commodore. The Falcon also had the big advantage of a proper double density disk drive, and also offered up a CD-ROM add-on from the get-go. The Amiga 1200 CD-ROM was never actually released. So even though there are areas where the 32-bit Amiga has the advantage, it's pretty clear that the Falcon was a better computer overall, which makes it even more of a shame that it wasn't a success. Atari would have the last laugh against their greatest rivals of course, as in 1994 Commodore International went bust, with all its assets being split up and sold off to different companies, whilst Atari Corporation managed to carry on until 1996, when they entered into a reverse merger with JT Storage, before later being bought by both Hasbro and Infogrames, with the latter officially changing their name to Atari in 2003, and are still going strong in the present day. Now, I already mentioned that one of the chief criticisms of this 32-bit computer was around the reuse of the case from its predecessor, and that Atari made it clear that this wasn't the original intention, and they were indeed working on more PC-like designs for the hardware that would especially benefit more serious users, including the Falcon 040 microbox of course. But that wasn't the only advancement of the Falcon hardware in the works, as around this time it was also rumoured that Atari were considering the creation of another home computer that would use the Atari Jaguar hardware instead. This wasn't completely untrue, because Atari were in fact developing a new hybrid system under the codename Painter. But this ambitious project combined both the 32-bit Falcon computer and the 64-bit Jaguar console into one very powerful multimedia system. It included an internal CD-ROM drive with a top opening lid, a floppy disk drive on the front, and 3 rear panel expansion slots. The front panel features keyboard ports, 2 joystick ports, a Comlinks port, power switch and the volume control buttons, with a 2-colour LED display panel. As you can see, the housing is very similar to that of the Falcon microbox, and it can also be placed vertically or horizontally like that unit too. Unfortunately, the Painter project was cancelled just as it reached the prototype phase. There are some mock-up cases out there and even a motherboard, although it's not known if this is fully working or not. So the project certainly got a lot further than most people imagine, but it was never officially announced to the press and no production prototypes were ever shown. It's likely that the Painter project was cancelled when the decision was also made to discontinue the computer so Atari could put all their focus into the Jaguar. A real shame, as this surely would have been an Atari dream machine. Atari officially discontinued the Falcon in November 1993, just as the new 64-bit Jaguar was launched, so they could put all their effort and now quite limited resources into supporting the new console. People were very critical of Atari's decision to drop the powerful home computer just over a year after launch, seemingly leaving its passionate user base in the lurch, but sales of just 30,000 units very much forced Atari's hand. In comparison, the whole Atari ST range sold around 6 million units worldwide, making it Atari Corporation's most successful venture. But it wasn't quite over for the Falcon, as it had one saving grace, and that was something that was carried over from the ST before it: its huge popularity as a computer for composing music. And the following year they struck a deal to sell the Falcon name and design, as well as all remaining inventory, to German company C-Lab, the creators and publishers of the market-leading Logic and Notator music sequencers. In 1995, some 2 years after the Falcon was officially discontinued by Atari, they launched their first model, the Falcon Mark I, which was basically the same except with a new badge and TOS 4.04 as standard. The Mark II would soon follow, which addressed a number of shortcomings in the original design, making it more suitable to use in a recording studio. These were unofficially termed Cubase modifications, and included line-level audio in, without the need for a preamp or mixer. The Falcon Mark X, or Mark X as some called it, was the very last model produced by C-Lab and was mounted in a 19-inch rack case with an external keyboard and space for internal SCSI hard disk drives. This somewhat extended the otherwise incredibly short life of the Falcon and kept the Atari legacy for music production going for many more years, even to the present day in many ways, as hugely successful music acts such as Fatboy Slim, Aphex Twin and Sister Bliss have all admitted to still having Atari computers in their studios which still get daily use. Back when I did my Atari Falcon hardware review, which I've linked in the description for those who haven't seen it, a lot of people moaned that I didn't talk about all the different hardware expansions that are offered for the 32-bit computer. That wasn't really the time or place, as I couldn't look at something I didn't have, but this most certainly is, so let's cover them off. Firstly, there are more standard upgrades like internal hard drives and flash drives, Gotek virtual disk drives, extra memory, more modern power supplies, new fans, USB ports, and even modems so you can connect your Falcon up to the internet. Most of these don't require much technical knowledge to fit and are pretty easy and fairly cheap to obtain. Then, for the more serious Atari fan, you have the whole new realm of hardware accelerators, which usually involve modifying the Falcon itself by changing over chips or moving it into a completely new case to allow extra room for the add-ons that won't fit in the standard case. The most popular of these is known as the CT60, which upgrades your Falcon from an 030 to an 060 by replacing the CPU. The newer and much more powerful version of the Motorola chip gives you a huge speed boost, up to as much as 100 MHz, and if you've already upgraded to the CT60, you also have the option of a Super Fidel board too, which replaces the standard Falcon GPU and gives you a new much faster one that also offers up true 24-bit colour with 16.7 million shades available, new screen resolutions including 1600x1200 and 1920x1080, and a new much faster and more powerful Super Blitter. I don't want to spend too long on this section giving you all sorts of confusing technical details. I just wanted to give you a flavour of what's out there for serious Falcon users, and I'm sure I've given you plenty to Google here. I recommend checking out the Exos website as an excellent starting point. I really wanted to end this video by talking about games, and I know people are always quick to point out the Falcon really isn't a games machine, unlike the rival Amiga 1200, and got very little support back in the day. But that specific point is what I want to expand on here. Now, we know the Falcon got very few commercial games back in the day, which is a shame given how well suited the hardware is for playing games, with the computer's main titles coming from Atari themselves in the form of Dino Dudes, Steel Talons, Roadrunner 4-wheel drive and Jeff Minter's wonderful Llamas app. But it has also been very well supported by indie and homebrew developers since the computer was discontinued in 1993. Now, I have already made an amazing facts episode on the Atari Falcon, which is of course linked down in the description, that shows 10 of these. But as you watch this video, you will also have seen many more, including the awesome Racer 1 and 2, which were inspired by the Lotus games, Mortal Kombat clone Azom Crypt, Joust inspired Killing Time, F-Zero like Rave, Arkanoid copy Impulse, and impressive FPS running. And speaking of FPS games, there are also some pretty incredible ports of famous PC shooters like Doom, Duke Nukem 3D, Hexen, Wolfenstein 3D and Quake, but most of these need a pretty beefy upgraded Falcon to play. And also on the theme of ports, there's been a recent effort to convert a number of games from the Japanese Sharp X68000 computer too, including the likes of Choren Shah, Pac-Mania and Galaga 88. Before I end this, I should also mention some of the other commercial games that Falcon users should look out for, because aside from the 4 Atari published games I already mentioned, there's Pinball Dreams from 21st Century Entertainment, Ishar 3 Transarctica and Robinson's Requiem from Silmarils, impressive 3D flight sim Gravon, fighting game Ultimate Arena, first person RPG Towers 2 and Polygon Extravaganza Moon Games. There were also 2 very interesting unreleased prototypes that were supposed to be released by Atari themselves in the form of Raiden, a stunning port of the famous Saibukai Hatsu arcade game that only has a few levels sadly, and the highly ambitious Space Junk that was supposed to be the Falcon's killer app. And that rounds up my look at 10 amazing Atari Falcon facts. Which of these fabulous facts was your favourite, or are there any other tantalising tidbits of trivia that you want to contribute? I always love to hear the thoughts and views of my audience, so please get typing in that comment section. Before I go though, I must thank all of my loyal patrons and YouTube members for continuing to support my channel and make videos like this possible. However, I must give special thanks to the following people in particular for their much appreciated pledges: Dee Vaughan, Albert Davis, Richard Baker, Martin Wiggins, Peter Grantham, Bernard Santu, Mins, Classic Gamer 74, Josh Hartman, Dennis Skronsky, Ben P. Stein, Tabby Kitsu, Grady Haynes, Paul Daniels, Seth A. Robinson, Kalimatorn, Carl Olsen, Mark Strickland, Big Chuzzle, Cole Cloping, Black Siren, John Alberino, Crispy Cream, Justin Cooney, Luke Boynton, Sarah B, Richard Tate, Tellboy 2011, Tiago Silva, James Welch, Wesley K, Glacier 9, Cellphone Smartphone, and Electron Star Collapse. If you also want to help support this channel, then you can now join as a member for as little as £2 a month, where you'll get access to exclusive videos and updates and much more besides. Just click the button on my community page to get started. My Patreon is also still available if you prefer to support me in other ways too. I've been the Laird, and thank you for watching, and I'll see you all again for another video very soon.